Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Hapade Zantro. Welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry. Today we're hearing an interview conducted with a former Peace Corps volunteer, John Whitbeck, who was here in the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, specifically in Saipan, from 1968 to 1970. He was recently interviewed by the executive director of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, Leo Pangilinan, when Leo was in New Mexico.
Hafade and Tiro, John.
Hafade.
Thank you for having this conversation with me.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Yes, definitely. So, John, you lived on Saipan as a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years between 1968 through 1970. Can you tell me a bit about how you came to join this organization and end up in Saipan?
Well, yes. So I grew up in a small rural area of small farms in northwestern Pennsylvania. And as I was going through, I finished high school, I went through college for 4 years. And I really felt that I wanted to be in a situation that would be very different with people that were of a different background, because I wanted to find out what I could learn from people who were not the same as the people around me. So when I joined the Peace Corps, you could go to South America or Africa or these other countries. But I found that the Peace Corps, I think they started it I went in 68. I think the first volunteers that went to Micronesia went there in like 66 or 67. So I was one of the early group of Peace Corps volunteers to go. And I went through my basic training on Rhoda for a couple of months. And then we were officially, they allowed us to become volunteers. First we were trainees, then we were initiated as volunteers.
We've been talking story these past, 24 hours.
Yeah.
I've learned that you've gone on to work with other Native American groups here in the United States, particularly in your home state of New Mexico.
Right.
So how have these experiences helped you reflect on the conditions of the people of the Marianas in the context of your own experiences with American policies, values, or just way of life?
I definitely find some what I feel are close similarities between Native Americans here in New Mexico, the ones that I've worked with and that I know, and the people that I worked with that I got to know on Saipan. Several things that I think are in common is when before it became a state, New Mexico became a state in 1913, but at one point it was a Spanish colony, and you had the Spanish Catholic Church come into New Mexico, and they treated the locals in a way that to me was very barbaric. Obey them and do what they told you to do. So it was very much a colony of, disrespect and ignorance, and no willingness to learn what you might know, what someone might know that you didn't know because they were of a different culture, if that makes any sense. The second thing that I find similar is with Native Americans that I've worked with here from different tribes, is they have a kind of consciousness of a reality that's much greater than just what's in their own hide, Like, I worked with the Choctaw also for a while in Mississippi, which is another tribe, And I would come with some of the Choctaw members to Albuquerque to meet with the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I remember taking them to a place where there were Native American remnants and so on, of pueblos and stuff. And as we're walking along in this natural environment, their consciousness, they would spot different birds and stuff and notice it much more quickly than I could. And I don't know how to explain that very well. It's just that there's a kind of, I keep using the term being conscious of, but they were able to personally, in a very realistic way, have experiences that I knew I would not be able to have, but I learned to respect that those experiences had specific value to their culture, and to try to describe those experiences. For example, on Saipan, people would have these experiences with tatamonas, and it would be a very, for the people who experienced it, it was very present, almost like as you and I are looking at each other. That's how they could communicate with people that were invisible to me.
Yeah.
I remember when I was on Saipan one day, I was sitting on the beach by myself and by Sugar Dock, and I saw this little speck way out past the reef. And I'm watching it because it's getting closer and getting larger. And it was an outrigger canoe. I think it had come from a different island group, maybe Yap or somewhere. And these guys came. At that time, I didn't ever see any outrigger canoes on Saipan itself. But this was from a different district. They landed on the beach. And I started talking to them. I said, wow, where are you guys from? And they told me. And of course, they knew how to navigate, right? Without, compasses and stuff. And I said, well, how did you know how to get here? And the guy who was a navigator said that his grandfather or somebody had given them directions of how to get here. And it worked for him to get there. The reason they came was that someone who was an ancestor from that tribe had died and was buried on Saipan. And they came back to see if that person's spirit was still at peace. So they came back to examine like a kind of burial site. And then the other thing they described to me is that there were 3 guys in this rather small outrigger, but the guy who was a navigator, it didn't take one day or so to get there, but he would kind of stay in this kind of, he said, well, it was like he was meditating the whole way. And once in a while he would taste the water and stuff. So it was like, in order for him to get over that distance as a navigator, he had to be very conscious in a way that I can't imagine any quote-unquote American being able to do or come even close to, So indigenous cultures, not just here, but also there's this common ability to be knowledgeable of things that so many other people are ignorant of.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to come back to that other part of the question about this contrast between Native peoples and American values. And I want to transport you back to those times because, we live under a commonwealth now in political union with the United States. And so obviously we embraced a lot of aspects of American values, namely democracy.
Yeah.
But reflecting back to sort of those aspirations that people had and how that sort of unraveled, where do you see sort of that divergence between, what you know of and your experiences living in American culture and maybe mainstream American culture,
exactly. True.
And what you experience there as part of the culture that may not be perhaps congruent with the native culture. Yeah.
Well, I was on Saipan from 1968 to 1970, and then about 5 years ago, which is more than 40 years later, for the first time I went back. And of course, Saipan was a very different than what I had experienced in 68 to 70, because there were many tourists. You had the Chinese building casinos and stuff. It's like it may benefit people economically, but if that prevents people from maintaining what they have known as a culture for many generations, then I feel it has a negative effect, in the sense that diversity allows things to be healthier than not any diversity. Especially I think as far as the culture for anyone, and for the ability to not let greed and self-interest be more important than the common good.
This is Your Humanities Half Hour. We'll be back after this break.
In Northern Marianas Humanities Council, Bulaguinahanya puri historian Marianas zan kultura. Sinyon soda SCCNN formacion gi zon mami website nmhcouncil.org, pat bisita gi YouTube, pat Facebook. Guahaloque diferentes clasen la bluna sinya un fan. In Northern Marianas Humanities Council, hazuzura todo y experiencia tautau.
Welcome back to Your Humanities Half Hour. Let's continue our interview conducted by Executive Director Leo Pangilinan of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council with former Peace Corps volunteer John Whitbeck.
My experience on Saipan was the first time I'd worked with American Civil Service people. And, for example, they insisted you had a public school system which was administered by the American Civil Service. Mm-hmm. And then I had the good fortune to be able to teach at Mount Carmel, which was a private Catholic school. And so by teaching at Mount Carmel, I was able to really teach things that I felt people would want to know. Whereas the Peace Corps volunteers who were working for the Civil Service Administration in the public schools were only allowed to teach people how to speak English. It was like English as a second language. It's like, how well do you pronounce English words? And how can we help you be more accurate? Can you hear the difference between tug and duck? Yeah.
You mentioned that. That was sort of the name of the curriculum, right?
Yes, that was the name of the curriculum. That was what was on the little thin book that was your quote-unquote textbook. So imagine spending a whole semester in front of a classroom trying to get them to discern very specific American English sounds. I mean, every student that I ever worked with when I was at Mount Carmel was very articulate. I mean, maybe they didn't pronounce every single word in English exactly the way I would have, which was what we wanted them to do, or the civil service expected that of them. But there was no barrier as far as how you pronounce words, in my experience, to your ability to gain knowledge and to become educated. So it was, I don't know, I mean, being there with the civil service up on, people used to call, the civil service employees lived on a higher point in the island. They had water 24 hours a day. We had water maybe for an hour or so a day.
This was Capitol Hill.
Capitol Hill.
At the foot of Mount Tapacho. What did you...
Yeah, so the people that I knew on Saipan, the families of the village, I lived in a village, and they would refer to Capitol Hill as Mount Olympus, not Mount Tapachow.
Yeah.
Because it was actually a more accurate description of that difference between American Civil Service people and the indigenous people who've been there for generations. And when I would have to deal with someone who happened to be there as a member of the civil service. They didn't pay taxes. They made a salary much, much higher than anybody that might be local in the school system.
We talked about this, and we
Right.
estimated that it would have been equivalent to about $100,000 a year.
A year now, yeah, easily, or maybe even 150.
Yeah.
Now, they had people that they had trained to teach who were Chamorro or Carolinian, who were from Saipan. We were supposed to call them host country nationalists, okay? But anyhow, see, there were all these things that were in place to make sure that we knew that the people on Saipan, we needed to educate them, and there was nothing they could educate us about. I mean, that's why you were a volunteer 24 hours a day. So one of the things that happened, and this was because of the public schools administered by the American Civil Services, as we started working with some of the local teachers, you know, like you're teaching this classroom and this person who's from Saipan is teaching in that classroom, and that person's been trained to teach by the American Civil Service. So when you consider what you were being paid for, the fact that you didn't pay taxes, and the other thing is if you came from Washington or somewhere to Saipan, all of your goods, whatever you wanted, was transported by ship, like your car, all that stuff for you. It was very much like you're colonizing through the civil service. So a number of the local teachers, as we got to know them, said, you know, we're teaching alongside the people who are American Civil Service people, and we're being paid 60 cents an hour. And we were hoping that, we've asked them if they could pay us another 5 cents. Could we go from 60 cents to 65 cents an hour? And those hours that were counted were only for the hours that the school was open. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about 9 months a year from, 8 to 3?
Yeah.
And we said, yeah, you know, that makes sense. So we said, look, why don't you just write a letter respectfully making a request for that increase as a group of local teachers, which they did. Mm-hmm. Once that happened, the Peace Corps volunteers who were on Saipan were called into a meeting by the American Civil Service educational administrators, and they said, look, for some strange reason, I guess they're so ungrateful, the local teachers have told us that they want a 5% increase. We said, okay. Like, we didn't know anything about that, right? Yeah. And then they didn't get the increase, so they came back and we met again, and they said, well, I guess this isn't going to happen. We said, well, you took the first step, but here's the second step. The second step is write another letter in a very respectful fashion and say, you know, as a group of local teachers, we have asked for a 5-cent increase in our salaries. And we're asking you if within the next 3 months, you make that happen. If in 3 months on this particular date, if that doesn't happen, we're not going to return to school. We're going to stay home. So then that alarmed the civil service even more. Mm-hmm. So they called us back into a meeting and said, okay, look, you know, this is what the local teachers have been telling us. And they now are threatening to say that they're going to walk out. And they said, so if they carry through on that threat, the way we're going to deal with this is that each Peace Corps teacher, this is in the public schools, is going to take on more students. Instead of maybe 30 kids, you might be dealing with 40 or 50. But we will find a way by using the Peace Corps teachers to make sure that the local teachers don't get that increase. You know, we'll break the strike.
Yeah.
So we said, okay.
And they were adamant about suppressing the wages for whatever reason.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were insulted that someone would dare to ask a nickel an hour increase.
It wasn't a matter of we don't have the resources.
No, it's not. It's a matter of, like, you're not grateful enough. And in fact, what they told the teachers, they said, well, the reason we're not giving you a nickel increase is because we're investing money in your education. Well, I imagine they've invested a lot more in the civil service Americans than they did in the local people. Anyhow. So during that time, the war in Vietnam is going on, and oftentimes people that were involved in the whole thing would go to Guam, and then from Guam, if they had a chance for R&R or whatever, like for example, some of the nurses that were in Vietnam, you know, would wind up coming to Saipan because they could get away from everything there.
Yeah.
Well, one of the people who started showing up once in a while was a bureau chief for either was like Newsweek or Time, I think. And he would come to Saipan, and we would run into him, like, you know, having a beer in a local bar or whatever, and we got to know him. And we started telling him what was going on with the civil service. He said, okay. So he worked with us because when the teachers walked out of the classroom, we did also.
The Peace Corps
volunteers. The Peace Corps teachers walked out with the local teachers. Now they were not able to maintain classes. We were the resource they needed, and we refused to be that. And to make sure that the locals didn't get another nickel an hour. So now what happened was the High Commissioner, who lived in Hawaii, came to Saipan from Hawaii. Not only did they fly him in, they flew in his limousine with, you know, American flags on the fenders and stuff. And we were assembled again at the Peace Corps headquarters, and he came in. We're all sitting there on like folding chairs. He goes up to the podium at the front. He says, okay, he says, here's the deal. He said, we've always known that the Peace Corps can be high gain, but also high risk. And he said, so what that means, he said, is that you're going to be sent home. He said, you either are in class tomorrow morning or you better pack your bags, right? Well, what he didn't know is that the bureau chief of this magazine was sitting at the back. And after he'd made his announcement and he was ready to leave, the bureau chief of Time or Newsweek stood up and he said, excuse me, sir. He said, yes. He said, well, let me introduce myself. Okay, I'm a bureau chief for Newsweek, he said, and I'm here because, you know, I'm the person that manages covering the Vietnamese War. But he said, I've had the opportunity to come here to be able to relax a bit. He said, but the other thing that I've discovered is the action you're taking, he said, will be an incredibly important event for our magazine to report to the public. He said, because what you're doing is that for the very first time since Kennedy started the Peace Corps, the American government is getting rid of employees, Peace Corps volunteers, regardless of how it impacts the people they're supposed to be helping. And the fact that he was there, and the fact that it was very fortunate that came out that way, because otherwise we would have wound up going home or, you know, being forced to not support the local teachers. I mean, supporting the local teachers was not any part of the value system of the civil service at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just kind of another.
So what was the outcome?
The outcome was that they gave them a nickel increase. So they were successful at learning how, if you stand together, i.e., you know, if you work as a union of employees, and if you stick to your guns, then you're not so helpless. You're not as helpless as the powers that be want you to be. And the fact is that by treating the local teachers as if they're real human beings for a change, it's something I think that everybody benefits from. It's like, maybe I'm not that inferior, you know? Maybe I am worth another nickel.
Right.
And no, certainly it was not a matter of not having the money. They told him it was. They said, well, we would do it, except that we have to use that money to give you further training.
Yeah.
So who's giving you the further training with the money, and how much are they being paid, to do so as a civil service person?
Well, I'm glad you shared that story, and particularly because I don't think I would have read anywhere in the record about the bureau chief particularly coming into this.
No.
And I think that also highlights the power not just of getting together. This might have been the first educational strike in our history, among local people.
And the fact is, what I remember clearly about that whole process is that the concept of a labor union was not anything that anybody had ever shared with people from Saipan.
Yeah.
Why and what for.
Right. And it also highlights the power of the media.
Yes, exactly.
Well, John, we're winding down with our interview, but I want to give you an opportunity to share any other thoughts or memories that you have about this period in your life working on Saipan and perhaps under the Trust Territory government.
Okay, well, during that time when I was on Saipan, in a way I kind of became like in the eyes of the other, maybe some of the other Peace Corps volunteers and so on, it's kind of like a black sheep, because the whole mantra of, if you're a volunteer, you have to be teaching people 24 hours a day, you have to be educating them, you have to be correcting the way. For example, the group that I went into the Peace Corps with, the males in the Peace Corps that were going to become volunteers, as they talked about what they wanted to accomplish, one of their big things was, we want to be able to have local kids become a member of the Boy Scouts, and specifically we want them. There was a division of American Boy Scouts, or they're called Sea Scouts or whatever. So we want local kids on Saipan to join the Boy Scout, Sea Scout group, because then we can teach them how to fish. Then we can teach them, how to swim. Well, you couldn't possibly have been on Saipan for more than a few days if you had consciousness of anything to realize how proficient people were at fishing, swimming, whatever. I mean, the ocean was part of their life. We didn't have to teach them something they knew better than we did.
Right.
And then the other idea was that if you're dealing with women on Saipan, we've got to teach them how to sew cloth and stuff. I mean, we have to. It's like you're not really. It's just, I don't know. I think, and so consequently, what would happen is like, I spent my time if I was either teaching or I wasn't like out there teaching kids after school how to swim, right? Mm-hmm. What I was doing is like, I was spending time with families and people within Chalankanoa where I lived, and it's like they treated me with respect. I tried to treat them with respect. I think I did, and it's like I was included as part of the family in a way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, John, for having this conversation with me today.
Sure. No, I'm so pleased that you're here.
Yeah.
And I get to spend time with you.
Today's show was an interview conducted by Northern Marianas Humanities Council Executive Director Leo Pangilinan with former Peace Corps volunteer John Whitbeck, who was here in Saipan during the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands Administration. He was here from 1968 to 1970. We hope you've enjoyed this look back. This has been Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
Your Humanities Half Hour is a production of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.